Well, the preacher's in trouble, and I wanted to be the one to tell you. We all make mistakes. We all do things that we regret at times. There are things in life we wish we would have done differently. I want you to know preachers are not perfect people. And I don't know where this is going, but I'm telling you, there could be some real trouble. Honestly, I don't know how this ends, but I wanted to be the one to tell you that it's just not good. Now, that's not about me. You can breathe. I can breathe now. But I wanted you to think it was, and that was awkward enough for me but I wanted you to think it was about me, because I wanted you to be able now to think about what you would think about if it were me. I wanted you to be able to think about what you would talk about at lunch today if I was talking about me. My legs are shaking now because maybe you already sent a text to Alicia saying, "What's going on?" I don't know. I wanted you to think it was me, because when things like that happen, man, we don't hide that under a hat very long, do we? We talk about it. We discuss it. It's what we talk about at lunch today. I think we know how those conversations go. Sometimes things happen in life, and they are the topic of conversation. You know, in our minds today, we're thinking about Las Vegas, and we're thinking about New Orleans, and we're thinking about what's next. These are the big ticket topics of conversation. When things happen in a community, sometimes it's all the news. It's all that people talk about for a while. And so I want you to have that in mind. What would you talk about if that was your preacher? If that was a guy that you had talked to for years and had relied on for, spiritual, theological questions and things like that for years, what would be your response? What would you think about that? I want you to go back to the town of Philippi. Now, you may have never been there, so it's hard to go back there, but we've read about it. We've read about Philippi. In Philippi, the preacher's in jail. What do you think they're talking about? They're talking about the same things we'd be talking about. Preacher's in jail. I can imagine at Philippi, maybe you know the origin story, maybe you don't, but Paul shows up one day, and some ladies and some folks are out at the river praying, and he strikes up a conversation, and Lydia, the seller of purple, is the first convert there in Philippi. And then he goes and he's thrown in jail, and he meets a jailer there, and Paul and Silas are singing, and the jailer is converted. That very night, very hour of the night, he and his household are baptized into Christ, and the church begins. And if they heard that their guy, Paul, had done some stuff that had landed him locked up in jail, are they thinking about that time down by the river? Are they thinking about the time that they met Paul in the prison, in the jail? Are they thinking about how Paul baptized them? They have these great memories of Paul, and I bet they're wondering, what in the world's going to happen to Paul? And so can you imagine the church, like we are today, the church gathered there in Philippi a couple thousand years ago on a Sunday morning, probably wondering, what in the world's going to happen to our church? What in the world's going to happen to us, this group of people that Paul planted and Paul's prayed for us, and what in the world is going to happen to us? Our preacher's in jail. Who knows what's going to happen with him? We don't know if we're going to last. We don't know if he's going to last. What in the world's going to happen to our church? And can you imagine in the back, a sickly man walks in. His name's Epaphroditus. Pretty common name back then, not today. And Epaphroditus has a letter. And that letter that Epaphroditus holds as he walks into that congregation is what we have in our Bibles as Philippians. And it begins by Paul greeting them. And then he launches into a prayer in verse 3, and he thanks God for all the things that he's done in his life and how God is working in the lives of the Philippians. And he talks about how he's got some problems going on right now. He speaks of his imprisonment in verse 7, but he's going to keep on defending and confirming the gospel with those folks, and how he can't wait to get back and hopefully see them again, but he's not sure that it's going to happen. I want you to pick up with me in verse 12. Paul says, I pray for you. I've been praying for you. I'm going to keep praying for you, but honestly, things haven't been great. They've not been great for me. Maybe they've not been great for you. He says, but I want you to know in verse 12 that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. What do you hear in that? You don't hear a guy who's wallowing in his self-pity, do you? Yeah, things are bad, right? Paul's in jail. Not sure how this is going to go. Preacher's locked up. That's not good. But he says it's really served to advance the gospel. It's become known throughout the whole imperial guard, the people who have locked me up, the people who are in charge of overseeing me now, and the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. They know why I'm here. You know, they know what landed me in this cell. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, they are much more bold to speak the word without fear. And so it's not just good for me and the correctional officers, it's good for everybody. People are more bold now that they hear about me, Paul says. Some, he says, they preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter, the ones who are preaching from goodwill, they do it out of love, knowing that I'm put here for the defense of the gospel. The former, they proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. Paul says, I'm in jail. I can't go out, and so there are other people who are trying to take my place, and they're preaching the gospel, and they're doing it out of envy and jealousy, and a little bit of strife is added in there, and he says, you know, that's okay too. What then? What does it matter? Verse 18, only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I will rejoice. And yes, he says, I will rejoice. That's Paul. Paul's in jail. The church has heard about it. The church has got to be wondering, what's going on with Paul? Is he ever going to get out? Is he ever going to come back? What are we going to do without Paul? What's going to happen to our congregation? What's going to happen to the church? Epaphroditus walks in. He's got a letter, and Paul essentially says, hey, I'm praying for you, and yes, things have not been great, but get your mind off of me. That's what he says. We're going to get to that part later. Praying for you. Things aren't great right now, but stop thinking about me so much. That's what Paul says. Locked up, in jail, not sure how it goes, but get your mind off of me because there are bigger things to think about. That is not to minimize Paul's prison sentence or anything like that. Nero is the emperor here. Nero doesn't like Paul. That's pretty clear. Nero doesn't like any Christians. He uses Christians to do a lot of horrible, terrible things, and is just not a friend to Christianity. Paul knows that. Paul's in prison, facing trial, likely to be executed, and he knows it, and the folks at Philippi know it, and the church is worried about him. The church is concerned about Paul, and they got probably some pretty good reasons to be concerned about Paul, but Paul says, look, this is tough, this is hard, it's not good, but you've got to move on and quit thinking about me so much. This is what he says, verse 19. He says, I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance, as it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not at all be ashamed, but that with full courage now, as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. Paul says, look, I don't know what's coming. He says, I feel like there's a chance I'm going to be delivered, but we all know how this is going to go eventually. Maybe for a little while we're okay, but not forever. We know how this is probably going to go, but it's okay. Paul says it's okay. Verse 21, for to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. And if I'm to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me, yet which I shall choose, I cannot tell. And he says, I'm hard-pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh, that's more necessary on your account. Paul says, I'm kind of caught here. You know, he's writing to the church, and they're upset, and they're worried, and what's going to happen to Paul, and what's going to be of the church here. And Paul says, hey, look, I'm going to live or I'm going to die. I don't know. It seems like in his writing, he seems to feel like he's going to live for a while, but he knows, I think in the end, what's coming. Nero doesn't like him, doesn't like Christians, and so he knows where this is going, but he says, it's okay. I'm good with it either way. To live is Christ. I'm going to have some fruitful labor. To die is gain. I get to go and be with the Lord. And Paul outright says, that's far better. I would seem to prefer that, Paul says. But he's got this remarkable mindset. His life is singularly focused on one goal. It's hidden with Christ. His goal is to spread the kingdom of God. Paul, in other places, would write that he has been crucified with Christ. It's not Paul who's living his life. He tries to live it like it's Jesus who is living his life. And he recognizes that his life is not really what matters right now. His life is not what is most important to him at all. It's the gospel. It is Jesus. And I'm thinking about our life, my life. And is the statement of Philippians 1:21, to live is Christ, to die is gain. Sounds great. And if we have any Bible verses memorized, there's a pretty good chance that Philippians 1:21 is one of those verses. It's short and it's kind of easy. To live as Christ, to die is gain. And so we may read it. We know it's there. We may have memorized the verse. It's a great verse. Is it consistent with our lives? That's the question. The question is not, did I know it? Did I memorize it? Can I recite it? I can. You can too. But does it summarize our lives? It's tough. I'm not asking you to say, absolutely it does. Live as Christ, die as gain. That's how I live my life. I'm saying, let's think about it for a few minutes. Is that our lives? Or is our common philosophy to live as me, to live as self, and to die is loss? It seems to me when we put those, on opposite ends, to live as Christ, to die as gain over here, and to live as me and to die as loss over here, I'm kind of drawn over here sometimes, right? This is kind of where our culture is, our society. It's me, it's us, it's self. It's not so much selfless. And so we dread death. And as we spend our lives dreading death, we miss out on a lot of life. And so a couple of questions this morning. What is life? What is it supposed to be? What's it supposed to be about? What's it supposed to be like? Is it Christ or is it me? We tend, and this is me, maybe it's you too, I think we tend to want everything in our lives to revolve around what we want. We want it to revolve around us, our dreams, our hopes, our ambitions, our plans, what we want to do. We kind of want our lives to revolve around what we want to do. In that case, if that's me, if that's you, then Jesus is merely added to life somewhere, and I've got my life, and I've got my dreams, and I got my hopes, and I got my ambitions, and I got my plans, and I got my religion over here, and we're going to check in every now and then, but it's not really life. It's not really life. It's part of it, but it's not the center. And the problem with that is that Jesus doesn't come just to be added to the periphery of our lives. He comes with some pretty challenging statements. Unless you are willing to deny yourself and take up your cross, then you can follow me. That's a challenging statement. To consider the interests of others, to do unto others, to love our enemies, to turn the other cheek. Those are challenging statements that don't happen if I include Jesus on the outside circle of life and not really bring him into the center. These are things that Jesus calls us to in order for him to become the new center of our lives. In Scripture, anything else that we put at the center of our lives is labeled as an idol. We don't use that term a whole lot today. We use them. We don't use the term idol or idolatry. So even as I mentioned that word, that's kind of a little bit old school. But there are things that we all worship. In fact, the question is not, are we going to worship? Because we're worshiping beings. We are created by God to seek something larger than ourselves, to seek something to satisfy us. And so we are worshiping beings created by God for that purpose. And so the question is not, will I worship? Of course I'll worship. That's who I am. That's who I'm created to be. The question is, what will I worship? Self, and a list of things under self, or Christ? I think we can probably condense the things that we worship into about four things, four major idols of our time: comfort, approval, control, and power. Comfort, approval, control, and power. Now, you probably don't have all of them. Maybe you don't. Let's hope we don't. But for some of us, our greatest idol is comfort, and so our greatest nightmare is stress and demands. And so in order to avoid stress and demands, we kind of shrink away, we back away. It's what the old writers called sloth. It's reluctance to do anything that my religion demands, that love demands. And so I back away because I like my comfort. For some of us, it's maybe approval. And our greatest nightmare is to be rejected by people. And so in order to avoid that rejection, we shrink back and we avoid doing a whole lot because I don't want to do anything that people may disapprove of. We're cowards sometimes if our greatest idol is approval. For some of us, it's control. And our greatest nightmare then is uncertainty because I want to be in control and I want to have every detail worked out and I want to know how everything ends. And my problem emotion then is worry because I'm not in control of everything. I don't have control of every detail, and so I worry about all the details that I don't have control over. For some of us, it's power. And our greatest nightmare is to be humiliated, and we don't want to do that. And so I want to have power over everything. And if I don't have that power, and I do face humiliation, then my problem emotion then is anger. I get upset and fly off the handle. When we live to self or live for me, that's what we end up striving for. Those nightmares are what we do our best to avoid, and the problems are those things that we deal with every day. That's it. And you may be sitting there like I'd want to be sitting there and thinking, I don't think any of those are problems with me. Comfort, approval, control, or power. Well, I don't know. Let's check. I put together some questions. Here's some of them. What do I worry about the most? I'm asking you to do this. If we're honest with ourselves, I think we can probably pinpoint what an idol in my life might be. What do I worry about the most? Could it be that that's the most important thing in my life? And I'm not saying it is. I'm asking you to ask yourself, could that be a problem? If I failed or lost it, what would cause me to not even want to go on? You have something in mind? If I failed at this, if I lost out on that, what would cause me to not even want to keep on? What do I use to comfort myself when things are bad? When things are difficult? When I'm faced with one of those nightmare scenarios where I don't have the control, I don't have the power, or I'm losing out on the approval, or whatever it may be, what do I use to comfort myself? Where do I rush when things are bad and difficult? That may be an insight into what might be an idol. What do I daydream about? What am I always preoccupied with? Where do my thoughts tend to fixate? This is a good one. What's the first thing I want people to know about me? Just met them, trying to make a good impression. What's the first thing I want people to know about me? What makes me feel worthy? What do I think is going to find some kind of approval for me? What unanswered prayer may make me think about turning away from God? I'm asking for it. I want it. I'd love to see it. I'd love to get rid of it. And if I don't get what I want, if I don't get what I want removed, then I may just turn away. These are tough questions, but they're good questions. They're hard questions because they make us think about what really is center of my life. If you came up with some pretty easy answers, can I tell you that that may be what it looks like when to live is me, to live is self. And if to live is self, then to die is to experience loss. If to live is me, then death becomes the end of whatever I have been striving for, whatever I've been working for. And I lose out then on what I've been idolizing. That is not true for Paul. If you think back to his words in Philippians chapter 1, he says to live is Christ. He's been crucified. His flesh is being killed off, and he's trying to live for Christ. And so he says, whatever it is, I'm going to live for Christ. I'm going to seek his will above all things. I'm going to seek the kingdom of God first in all things. That's what it's going to be. And death, not loss. Death is when Paul really begins to live. Everybody in this room is going to face it. It's pretty much a sure thing these days. And for Paul, death is gain. Because Paul understands that that's when things get better. To me, to live as Christ, to die as gain, because Paul says, what I want to do is to go and be with the Lord. That's what he longs for. Is that hard for you to envision? It is for me. Is it hard for you to think about seeing that blessing? Paul would eventually experience what he imagines here, to live as Christ, to die as gain, when at the hands of the Romans his life is ended because of his faith. And though death to Paul was an enemy, he says it's the last enemy, 1 Corinthians, Paul could face that enemy knowing that it was not his end. It was a time of transition, a time of change for Paul, where he would become what he ultimately has always wanted to be. To live as Christ, to die was gain. What that tells me about Paul is that he's committed to a cause that is much bigger than his own life. He's committed to something that is much bigger than just what he sees in front of him. He would do his part while he could, and he says, it's, for me, I would long to stay here and to work and to preach and to teach folks. I want to continue the fight. But Paul knows that this fight is bigger than just one life, his life. And so he writes a letter. The church is gathered, worried about Paul. Man, I was there at the river. I was there in the jail. Paul baptized me. Now we heard that Paul's in prison, and we don't know what's going to become of Paul. We don't know what's going to become of our church. In walks Epaphroditus with a letter. And the letter is Philippians, and Philippians is about encouraging the church to take a big picture view of life. Not so singularly focused on our own lives, but the big picture of what really matters. It's a letter that encourages us to join the fight against the powers of the world, against the idols of our own lives, and to seek first the kingdom of God, the life that entails. It's a call from Paul to join the fight, to live for Christ, to shine as lights in our world today, in our world. It's a call from Paul to have the mind of Christ as our mind, to live our lives as we think Jesus may live our lives. That's the cause. And it's not easy. It's not an easy call. Nobody ever said it was going to be easy. There will be times of doubt. There will be times of struggle, times of pain, times that things didn't go exactly like I wanted them to go, and it hurts. It's a tough fight sometimes, but Paul's call is a charge to revolt against the ways of the world. When we have hope in the middle of dark times, that's a light to the world. When we have trust in the middle of crazy, chaotic times, that's a light to the world. When we have faith, when maybe there seems like no reason for it, sometimes that is a light to the world. When we love people as we're called to do, and they don't love us back in return, and we keep doing that, that's a light to the world. It's a charge to revolt against the ways of the world. And it's not easy to do that when not many people are doing it. It's not easy to do it when a lot of folks that we know are just not doing the right thing. It's not easy to be the one that stands up and says, I'm going to do it. And so here's what Paul encourages them to do. Look down at verse 27. He says, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. We're trying, right? If to live as Christ, die as gain, then yep, I want my life to be lived in a way that's worthy of the gospel of Jesus, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. What I want to call your attention to as we close this up, he says, I want you to be striving side by side. That's a military term. It's not the picture of a soldier going out and fighting a battle by himself while everybody else is just hanging back somewhere else. It's a picture of people who are united, arm in lockstep with one another, going and fighting this battle. Christianity is a team sport. Christianity is something we do with one another. We need each other. We rely on one another. We support one another. We spur one another on to love and good works. I can't do those one another things without one another. It's a team sport. And so Paul says, look, you are called to live a Christ-like life in the middle of a world that is a lot of times hostile to that kind of living. We are called to live a Christ-like life in a world where a lot of people are just not really set on doing that right now. And so if we are, then we need each other to strive side by side with one another. That's the beauty of a church. It's the beauty of a group of people, a community of Christians who are gathered together to support, to love, to challenge, to convict, to encourage one another. It's beauty of a room filled with people like this. We need each other. And what I don't want you to lose sight of is that other people may need you. A lot of folks at Philippi on the day when Epaphroditus walked in were probably pretty upset. And they needed somebody like him to come in and encourage them. They needed people around them to sit around and encourage them. You may be going through some tough times right now. And you may need somebody You may know somebody that needs somebody like you, and today what you need to do is be that person for that person, striving side by side with one another. There's a short phrase that sometimes we miss. When I had the slide on the screen, to live is Christ, to die is gain, I missed a part. Did you notice? That's not actually the whole verse. To live is Christ, to die is gain is the latter part of the verse. The first part, for to me, to live is Christ. What I do or don't do with this verse is a personal decision. Paul said, for me, all right? What I'm deciding to do is I'm going to live for Christ, and I recognize that death is gain. He recognizes that it may not be for everybody. It may not be the case for everybody. But Paul had made that personal decision, for to me, this is what life is. I'd like to ask you, to you, what is life? What is life to you? Is it self? What I want, my plans, my ambitions, my goals, my way? What is life? Is it self or is it more? When I ask you that question, do you deep down sense that life should be a bit more than what you've made it right now? That you should think about life a little bit differently than you think about life right now. That you should be pursuing things that are a little bit more important than the things that you've been pursuing right now. It's personal. Paul had decided that for me, to live is Christ. I'd like to ask you, what are you deciding about life? With how you live yours, with how I live mine, with how we value things in life, with what we deem is important to life. What is life to you? This morning, you may recognize that life should be a little bit more. You may deep down know that life should be a bit more than you've made it. It's not so much about what I want. It's not so much about my desires, my selfish ambitions. It shouldn't be about that. It's about what Christ wants for us, what God, the creator of the universe and the creator of us, wants for us, and how he tells us we should live our lives. Maybe today you decide life needs to be different for me. A little bit or a lot of it different for me. For some of us this morning, it may mean that today I'm going to decide to give my life to the Lord and make a commitment to the Lord, to be united with him, to be baptized into Christ, united in his death, come out of the waters, ready to live a new day, a different kind of day where life is not self and me, life is Christ. Where we die to ourselves, we put off the old so that we can put on the new, and life is Christ. Where we get rid of our mistakes, our past, our guilt, our failures, and we come out of the water, and life is Christ. Maybe for you are a Christian, been one for a long time, but life has been maybe more about seeking approval or comfort or power or control or whatever it may be. For you, you've been seeking things, and it's left you pretty unsatisfied, pretty unhappy with where life is right now. And maybe for you, life needs to get back to being about Christ and seeking his will and seeking first his kingdom. Maybe for you, there are things happening that we have not even talked about yet today, but it's on your mind, it's on your heart. And like those Christians gathered in that congregation a couple thousand years ago, you need somebody to hear you, to listen, to pray for you, to support you when things aren't great. To live is Christ, to die is gain.